Thanks for tuning in. And Anthony Lewis has joined me again to talk about the location of solar revolutions chart. Thanks, Anthony, for joining again.
My pleasure.
Yeah, and I mean, this seems to be something that has been unaddressed, or I don't know whether it is addressed or not. So, but it seems like not many people have been debating about it. There is a lot of debate about tropical and sidereal and various house systems, but location of solar revolutions seems to be unaddressed, because I think there are really two camps where one set of people use cast the solar revolutions chart for the birth location, where the other side kind of they cast the solar revolutions chart for the location of the physical presence during the solar return. So this seems to be confusing, and I'm not sure which works out, but I think in my experience and my testing, I think solar revolutions for the birth location kind of works better than the location of the physical presence. Um, but that's just so far from what I tested. So do you think this is a topic to be addressed, and kind of, does both the things make sense?
Yeah, you're right. It is a controversy in the literature. Excuse me.
Okay.
Seasonal allergies.
Oh, no problem.
It is a controversy in the literature, and there are camps about this. People sometimes get into very dogmatic positions, like do it this way, it's the only way to do it, your way is wrong. And that happens with the location of the solar return. And then there's a debate about should you use the tropical position of the sun or the sidereal position of the sun. That's the other big debate. And in that debate, those who use the sidereal position, some do it with the sidereal zodiac, and some do it with the sidereal sun, but in the tropical zodiac.
Yeah.
So that so there's all these possibilities. If we look at the history of solar returns, let me say the other thing about birthplace versus relocation. And there is a group of astrologers who firmly believe that you should choose the location on Earth to have your best solar return. So that, say you had a very afflicted Saturn in your chart, and you had a year in which it was going to come right on the ascendant, you might move across the world somewhere so it was hidden away, or some benefic planet was on the ascendant.
Yeah, I know.
And avoid your fate. And there are some astrologers who every year will plan their vacation around their solar return and go to a point in the globe that they believe will be most beneficial to them. Now, how did this get started? My understanding from reading the literature, and I haven't read everything, so there may be gaps in my knowledge here.
Okay.
But as far as I can see, this idea of doing the solar return at the location of the person rather than the birthplace is relatively recent. Recent meaning the first mention I have seen of it is in Marinus in the mid-1600s.
Okay. And
prior to that, in all the literature I've read, the solar return was always done at the birthplace.
Yeah.
So, and I think the reason for that historically is, well, the solar return initiated probably in Hellenistic Greece, Egypt, that region.
Yeah.
And if you saw your astrologer around your birth date, the astrologer would simply take your birth chart and do a representation of it, probably on some board with sticks and stones or something, and then so they would take your birth chart and place the natal transits around the birth chart. So it basically was a transit chart. In other words, I think the original solar return was regarded as the most important transit chart of the year. It was the chart when the sun returned to its original position, and then the transiting planets would be in different places than they were at birth. and the change in location from the birth location to the solar return location was read as significant or an omen of something that would occur in your life.
Yeah.
Am I making sense?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
So in other words, the astrologer would take your birth chart, place the transiting planets around it, see where they fell, what houses they fell in, what signs they fell in, what aspects they were making to each other and to the natal planets, and give you interpretations.
Okay.
So for example, suppose your natal Saturn is, picking on Saturn here, is somewhere, let's put it doesn't matter where it is, but in the transit on your birthday, it's right in your 8th house, and it's opposite your ascendant ruler. Well, that's probably a dangerous year for you, because the 8th has to do with length of your life, and if you have Saturn, a malefic, opposing your ascendant ruler, it could shorten your life that year.
Yeah.
So I mean,
sure.
so I think that's how it started.
Okay.
And then by the time it got to the Persian Arabic astrologers, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, that period, it's interesting. I don't read Arabic or Persian, but reading Ben Dyke's, if you read his translation, they don't talk about the solar return. They talk about the revolution of the year.
Yeah.
The solar return, the year happens to be measured by the sun returning to its natal position. And as far as I could understand from Ben Dyke's text, it was calculated simply by adding the duration of the year sequentially to the birth chart.
Yeah.
And interestingly, Abu Mashar used the tropical year, not the sidereal year. But he did use the sidereal year for his mundane predictions. So he seemed to make a distinction between, if it's a person, the tropical year is more significant to measure returns. If it's the nation or the world in general, the sidereal seem more symbolically significant. Sure. I thought that was a very interesting distinction.
Yeah, I mean, Indian astrologers also make that distinction when they work with Tajika, which is the annual prediction method in Indian astrology. And even astrologers using the sidereal zodiac, I mean, predominantly astrologers use sidereal zodiac in India. But in Tajika, some of the astrologers use the tropical position of sun to calculate the yearly chart. So,
but in the Varshafal, they use the sidereal, right? I'm pretty sure they stick with the sidereal year.
In Tajika, there is a little bit of controversies in terms of whether they use sidereal or tropical.
So the Persian Arabic astrologers, and as far as I know, the Indian astrologers of that period used the birthplace. Nobody was using although I had read some texts where the Persian astrologers were certainly aware that changing location could change the chart. And I think they used those principles in electional astrology, which makes some sense, because if you change the location of where you begin an event, it would change the chart of the event.
I think there is no controversy when it comes to location for electional astrology, because I think there is no second thought itself, but that's not the case when it comes to casting a solar returns chart. So,
right. Now, the idea of, again, this is my reconstruction of what I think they were thinking. So it's not something I read really. The birth chart was considered the root, the radix, the radical chart, literally the root, meaning the image was that the person was like a plant. And the plant has roots, and everything grows from those roots.
Sure.
So that everything that happens in the life of the person develops from the root, and the root is the birth chart. And the idea of transits to the root would be, the root is going to be the root. A plant doesn't uproot itself and plant itself in another location. The root stays where it is.
Exactly.
And then the branches and the vines go out. And so I think the image, if we could use a metaphor here, is that in the ancient system, we people, unlike animals that roam, were more like plants that grew from a root and developed, and that what we saw up in the branches was just something that grew out of the root, and what happens to the root is essential to what happens up in the branches. And so the annual return would affect the root. Now, your root might be here, and if you have a big tree, your branch might be several feet away, or I guess it could extend around the world, actually, right? If you're a big enough plant.
Sure. Yeah.
So that the idea is not so much what's happening up in the leaves, but what's happening at the root.
Sure.
And how do the stars at birth develop? It's sort of a developmental model.
Okay.
Now, and that's kind of a philosophical principle that's somewhat non-scientific. Science would tell us we're animals and we can walk around and we don't carry our roots with us. But there's this sort of mystical view that the root is part of us. We are spiritual beings, and our spiritual part has this root which is rooted where we're born.
For sure.
And the place and time, moment of birth and place of birth are an essential part of who we are.
Exactly.
And anything that affects that root will affect what's happening in our life now. Now, Marinus came along, and he was in the mid-1600s. And Copernicus had been the previous century. Galileo had been the beginning of the 1600s. And so there was a very strong scientific movement, which was trying to separate science from religion and philosophy, basically. And so Copernicus and Galileo got into big trouble with the Catholic Church because their scientific ideas contradicted sort of biblical notions of how we came to be. And Marinus was very much into, we have to make astrology a science. It has to be consistent with science. It can't be based on religious ideas or what he called superstitious ideas. And so he regarded anything that was not scientific in the sense that there was clear cause and effect that was provable, observable, and could be shown by scientific method. That had to be thrown out of astrology because that was superstitious nonsense of the Arabs. He didn't like Arabs particularly.
Okay.
There was a bias against the Arabic culture. And so he, I think, had access to a lot of the old texts, but anything that wasn't based on current measurement and scientific principles, he would throw out. For example, the whole idea of using profections in astrology, he thought was nonsense. It was based on the belief that every year a new sign would take over. Well, where's the scientific evidence for that? There isn't any. He threw out, I think, virtually all of the Arabic parts, what were called Arabic parts at the time, because he thought they were just somebody's fanciful notions without scientific evidence. And in his view, astrology had to be cause and effect, so that if the stars, let me back up. I think in Mesopotamian Babylonian times, the stars were regarded as omens. It was a divinatory science. They were doing divination, not science. They were seeing correlations, but they thought these were messages from the gods. And even the Hellenistic Greeks had a notion of the universe being a living being, living intelligent being that could communicate with us through the stars. Marinus thought that was all nonsense, that relating gods to planets and the universe being alive somehow and having intelligence is total nonsense. We got to get rid of it. And so in his mind, what really goes on, this is his belief system now, is that the stars are physical forces and they have a particular nature, each force. And because the stars are forces, you know, like in Newton, if there's every action has an equal and opposite reaction, the forces have to act on something. They have to act on a physical being. They can't act spiritually or symbolically or in a divinatory way. They have to act on a spiritual being, on a physical being. And he was almost trying to make a science of physics out of astrology. And so to him, if the stars are physical forces, the only thing that made sense was that on the day of the solar return, the stars could only act on the person where the person is, because your body is what the stars act on, right?
Yeah.
If you're not where you were born, the stars can't influence you there because you're not there. If I want to punch you, I have to be in the room with you and I have to punch you, right?
Yeah,
if I punch the area you're born in, you're not there, it has no effect. That's his model.
That can also act against, because there is no actual physical thing that kind of that kind of influences human here. So I think as you said, we are all spiritual beings, and it's I think divination takes over rather than some physical thing, or I think a lot of things are abstract here, and there is no force that kind of has a physical influence on human beings. And hence I think it can also argued on the other way, that it doesn't really make sense to use the physical presence as as an important thing to use it for casting a solar revolution chart. But to argue for solar revolution chart, I think the same idea, as you said, it can also be used as an argument for casting the solar revolution chart for the location of the physical presence of a human being. So it kind of works.
That's his argument, right?
Yeah, so it kind of works both ways. But on the other hand, I think it also brings about a divorce between the natal location or the natal chart and the solar revolution chart, because I'm not sure about the indications that a solar revolution chart that is cast for the physical presence of a human being can actually or potentially indicate that is related to the natal chart. So once we don't cast a solar revolution chart for a birth location, I just think it divorces the solar revolution chart from the natal chart, and it just doesn't carry much meaning because it is no more connected to the natal location. That's what I felt. But again, the problem with this technique is every argument that we can make against can also work for. So
right. Well, I think it's the reason for the different approaches is there's different views of what astrology is and how it works.
Yeah.
And if you want to be a strict scientist about it, then Marinus is the position you're going to take. If you're more into a divinatory approach, I guess either would work, because you take the symbols where you can get them. The gods don't.
Yes.
Don't restrict themselves to one place or the other.
Yeah, I think it works because I was kind of dogmatic with this, and I was arguing for the natal location. But over a period of time, and over the period of time, it's not just too long, but it's just 1 month. I've turned a bit non-dogmatic about this approach, because I've seen people make predictions with both the things. So I think there is no point in putting a hard and fast rule, especially when it comes to a technique in astrology, because if that's the case, horary astrology is never going to work. And only if we stick to astrology as it is a divination, a lot of things will make sense and predictions will make sense. So I think I've come out of my dogmatic position of casting the solar revolutions chart to birth location, but still I wanted to have the conversation and talk about various things that are possible regarding this issue before I kind of wind up with a specific approach.
But so we have a model for approaching this. Let me tell you, I became aware of this controversy many years ago. And so what I started doing is I look at both.
Ah,
I do the solar return for the birthplace, and I do the solar return for the current location.
okay.
And what I found is they both work. They just give a different perspective. And see, I think what happens, and if you read the literature, a lot of astrologers will say, they'll take one major event that year. Like, say this is the year you had a car accident.
Mm.
And they'll look at the birthplace return and they'll look at the relocated return. And they'll say, oh, well, the car accident shows up more clearly in this return, so this is the right one.
Okay.
But that's one day of the whole year.
Ah.
I mean, you can't say a solar return is valid based on one incident.
Sure.
You really have to look at the entire year, everything that happened, and do the comparison that way. And if you do it that way, you'll find that one return highlights certain things and the other return highlights other things, or even the same event, one return will give a different perspective on it.
Okay.
And if you know the person well enough, or if it's your own life, I mean, you really have to know the biography of the person well to do this. But if it's your own life, you know what you lived through, then it's easier to see, and you can see both perspectives. I see them as giving different perspectives. And a model for this is a lot of people do what's called relocation astrology. That is, they'll take the birth chart as the root chart. That's the most fundamental chart you have. But then they'll say, well, let's say your chart. If you were to move to London, what might life be like for you in London? Well, we would just simply recast your birth chart as if you were born in London.
Born in London, yeah.
And see where the planets fall against those house cusps and that ascendant and midheaven. And we then say, well, if you were in London, your life would probably be a little more like this.
Sure. Yeah.
We wouldn't say it completely negates your birth chart. We just say it gives a different tone to it, a different slant to it. Your birth chart is always fundamental.
Sure.
And so that's how I view the solar return, that the return to the birthplace is the return of the root. And that's always going to be influential. But how that may play out in your life that particular year will be colored by the relocated solar return.
Okay.
Right. The planets will be in the same positions, but the angles will be different and the house cusps will be different if you're using quadrant houses.
Okay. Yeah, for
sure. And I find that system, it's a little more work. But
yeah, I mean, solar revolutions is already huge work, but still, so yeah. And I was having something else in my mind. Going back in history, I think the Greeks, early astrologers like Valens and Dorotheus, maybe they did not have this idea of relocating the solar revolutions, because not many people used to travel during those days, because travel was very tedious and also very dangerous. So this entire concept itself might not have originated in their minds because of less travel. Only those people who are closely associated with the court or the trade will travel, and the rest of the people are probably staying at one place. And there was no need for a recasting solar return to a different location. So this is just a theory, but
Mhm. But see, you're being very scientific. I think it's much more spiritual, religious. That Marinus says in his book, because he's the guy who introduced this idea.
okay,
Why should it be possible that changing your location could change how the natal chart unfolds that year? And he said the reason is that God is merciful and good, and that God gave us the ability to change our
sure,
location
yeah,
to minimize the bad things that might happen to us. A very religious position. The Hellenistic Greeks, I think some of them were influenced by Plato and his mythology. And he has, I think it's in the Timaeus, the myth of air. Do you know that myth?
yeah,
And the idea there is that he's talking about reincarnation, that the soul, when it's about to come back to another life on
incarnation.
earth, is paired with the good daemon, his daemon, who guides him. And together they pick the proper moment and place of birth so that this soul can then have the life it needs in this cycle. And so in that sense, they pick the root, they pick from which the life emerges and grows. And the root is something like essential. It's the core. It doesn't change.
Sure.
It's defined in terms of a location on Earth, but it isn't restricted there. It's who you are, basically. It's the most fundamental thing about you from the astrological perspective is the natal chart, because that's something the soul has picked for this lifetime. And it's something that defines who this soul is during this lifetime. And no matter where you are on Earth, it's that root that is what's unfolding. And
Yeah.
so it's a different spiritual perspective.
I think there is divination in both,
Yeah.
because there is no possibility to work except for, some kind of divination in both the, ways of calculating solar revolutions. So, do you think we can just go on and look at some charts?
Sure. I prepared something, you prepared something. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, I think you can go ahead first.
Okay, so let me, I think I have to share the screen here.
I'll just
Give
take
me
my
a second.
water bottle.
Share screen, okay. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah. Sure.
Maybe I'll make it bigger. Let's see. It's still visible. It's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It's fine.
Okay. Now this is a guy who's famous in Spain. Maybe not the rest of the world. What I picked this chart because he died on his 52nd birthday. So that's a very interesting occurrence to begin with. He was a naturalist who had a TV show that was very popular.
Okay.
Okay. And he's born in 1928, died in 1980 on his 52nd birthday. So he died on the day of his solar return. So I thought that would be interesting to look at.
Sure.
And he died not where he was born, but he was in Alaska shooting a film. So he died quite a distance from his birthplace.
Yeah.
So this gives us a chance to look at both charts and to see what they might tell us. Okay. I think I already said this. He's born in March 28. It was a Mercury day during a Venus hour.
Mm-hmm.
And he died in Alaska in a plane accident. So when I hear plane accident, I think of the ninth house, air travel, maybe Uranus, Mars, things like that, maybe Saturn. His profected ascendant was in Scorpio, so there's a Mars influence that year.
Yeah.
Mars, I will see the conjoins the natal eighth cusp. I think I used Placidus cusps here.
Okay.
And his Lord of the Orb, which is I think Ben put this in his newer book on solar returns.
Lord of the Orb.
which I find to be a really interesting technique. And interestingly, Ben didn't have it in his Latin translation, although it was available in the Latin literature in other places. And I know astrologers in Spain and Italy have been using it for several years.
Okay.
Okay, so here's his natal chart in Spain, Burgos, Spain. And so natally, he has Mars on the 8th cusp. So there's a natal potential for maybe violence at the time of death. This is the tropical zodiac, by the way. And he has a Uranus right on the midheaven. So something unusual, unexpected about his public reputation. Okay. Let's see, Saturn rules his 8th. It's Aquarius there. His ascendant ruler is the moon. And his moon conjoins Saturn and squares the sun in the 9th. So there's all these indications in the birth chart that he needs to be careful while traveling by air.
Okay.
And Jupiter rules his 9th cusp. And Jupiter is square to Pluto. Where's that? Yeah, Jupiter's 11 of Aries, Pluto's 15 of, and Pluto's in the 12th quadrant house. So again, there's this notion natally of maybe air travel or long distance travel is risky. So I think it's, and this is the basic principle of Hellenistic astrology, that the root chart is the natal promise. Everything grows out of the root chart. So we study the root chart first. And then at age 52, because Cancer's rising, Scorpio is his perfected ascendant. And Mars rules the perfected ascendant. And so his natal Mars on the 8th, this becomes a prominent feature of the year, the prominent natal feature of the year. Okay. So we'd expect Mars conjunct the 8th cusp to somehow manifest in his life at age 52. Now, it doesn't have to be a death or an accident. It could be other things. But, let's see. I think I just said all this. Here I'm just explaining why I think Scorpio is the perfected ascendant at age 52, but we all know that. Okay. Here's the perfections. And Marinus threw this whole thing out. He said, this is too superstitious. They're just going by numerology and this is garbage. Don't even pay attention to it. But I think this is a fundamental thing to do with solar returns. So at age 52, it's the 5th sign, which is Scorpio, 5th from Cancer. And the ruler, the 5th sign, Scorpio, in his chart is right on the 8th cusp.
Cool.
Okay. Lord of the Orb. For those not familiar with it, because it's not a real popular concept yet, but it's very powerful.
Yeah.
You take the planetary ruler at birth. Now remember, his planetary hour ruler at birth was Venus. And then you go in the Chaldean order, which is Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, and you count down. So at age 52, he is in this D position. So if he starts with Venus, we go Venus, Mercury, Moon, Saturn. Saturn is his Lord of the Orb this year. So at age 52, two prominent, like time lords, if we want to use that expression, are the perfected ascendant ruler Mars and the Lord of the Orb Saturn. So the two malefics are governing this year. So you'd expect this to possibly be a difficult year.
Absolutely.
Any questions about this slide? Or
can you just go back to the natal chart for a moment?
Oh yeah, let me go back. There he is.
Okay.
So this year we have perfected Lord is Mars, and Lord of the Orb is Saturn, which is right on the 6th cusp, conjunct the Moon, which is the ascendant ruler, and conjunct Ketu.
Yeah, and Mars is in the 7th house, and 7th house is also the house of death. Not necessarily, because in Vedic astrology, 7th house is the Marga house. And most of the traditional texts also associate 7th house with dangerous life events.
Right. And, this isn't a Saturn afflicting his moon. Mars here is the out of sect malefic too in Hellenistic, so it
Sure, yeah,
tends to be quite malefic in his chart.
yeah,
And Saturn, this cluster here it's right on the sixth cusp, and which is an unfortunate house, I think, in
yeah,
Vedic too.
yes,
And Saturn's afflicting his ascendant ruler, so you'd expect some sort of bodily illness at least
yeah,
with this, and maybe some sort of accident with the prominent Mars.
yeah.
Okay, so let's go down. We did that. Okay. So here's his birthplace solar return.
Okay.
And I'm just looking at this as a standalone chart. I always look at it as standalone and compare it to the natal chart. And when I compare it to the natal chart, I put the natal chart inside and the solar return outside. Then I
Okay.
reverse it. I put the solar return inside and the natal chart outside. So interestingly, his Lord of the Orb is Saturn, and this again is tropical.
Oh, Saturn is in the 8th house.
Saturn is in the 8th of and it rules the ascendant.
Yeah, for sure. And I think Capricorn happens to be the 7th house in the
Right, he has
natal
Cancer
chart.
rising.
Yeah. So
Right.
7th house. Yeah. Again, 7th house matters.
And then Jupiter, which ruled his natal 9th house, is right in the cusp of the 8th house. Pretty much exactly.
Yeah.
And it's very close to Mars. Mars is the lord of the profected ascendant.
Sure.
So he's got this very tight Jupiter Mars conjunction across signs in tropical. They'd be in the same sign in sidereal. And so this is all happening in or conjunct the 8th house cusp. So this is a dangerous year for him.
For sure, yeah.
And the other thing I notice in doing solar returns, and I've written about this and I lectured about this a couple of years ago, I use the true almost always. Those are years of dramatic life events, dramatic changes. And whoops, can you hear me? It says the internet connection is unstable.
Yeah, it just went off. I lost you for a moment.
I'll repeat it.
Okay.
I use the true node in solar returns.
Okay.
Because I want to see whether it's stationary or not.
Okay.
If the true node is stationary in your solar return, it almost always means a major, dramatic, life-altering event of some type.
Oh.
Sometimes it's like this, he had a plane crash or severe illness. Sometimes it's not so negative. But if you think of the mythology of the nodes, the stationary node is kind of like the moment when Vishnu throws his disc and cuts the serpent in half, right? So it's like getting cut in half, getting your head cut off the rest of your body.
Yeah.
It's like that moment is the stationary moment. And so often there's an event in the life of the person. I've seen this repeatedly. It's just over and over and over again. If you look at, I think, I may be wrong, but I looked at Boris Johnson's chart.
Okay.
And I think this year he has a stationary node and he came down with coronavirus and ended up in the ICU.
Oh, that's interesting.
I think I'd have to double check, but I'm almost certain.
Okay.
But if you look for that and it's in the solar return, if the node is stationary in the solar return, almost invariably. So
that's great.
And it's also, he's got Mars right on the node, right? Look at that.
Yeah, that's very close.
So to me, this looks like a very difficult year for him. Right?
Yeah.
And this is the birthplace.
Okay.
Now, and what is this? Here's his solar return inside in the birthplace, and here's his natal chart outside. So what I did is I simply took the previous chart and put his birth planets around it. And so here we see his birth, at birth he has an ascendant Pluto conjunction, and here it's right on the seventh cusp opposing the ascendant.
Okay.
So that looks quite difficult.
Mm.
He has the moon of his birth, which is his birth ascendant ruler, right on Neptune. So that's a potentially difficult. And what else do we see? Here's his sun in the second. Do you see other things here? I don't see anything that dramatic. I mean, to me, the Pluto opposite the ascendant is quite significant. That usually, again, is some sort of a dramatic life event. Pluto is transformational.
Okay.
And okay, so here's his relocated solar return.
Okay.
So again, in Alaska, I don't know exactly where the plane took off from, but this is the solar return for where the crash took place.
Okay.
Which was near where they took off and they flew a little bit and crashed. So the angles may be a little bit off, but it's very close.
Saturn's in the first house.
And here, so it was Capricorn in the birthplace rising. Here it's Virgo rising. Mercury rules the solar return. Chart, and here, look, Saturn is in the first, exactly opposite the solar return sun. This is at the site of the crash, right? I mean, 42 minutes, 38 minutes. I mean, it's exact. So here is a guy in Alaska. So if you just look at Alaska, if he said, should I be in Alaska on the date of my solar return?
And people should not get confused, because they might think that we are actually taking the chart of the time of death, but this person was born and he also died on the same day. So
this is at age 52, calculating his solar return in Alaska, if he had traveled, which he was in Alaska.
Yeah, this is not exactly cast for the death time, but for the actual solar return, because he was born and died on the same day.
No, this is the solar returns, not the death time.
Exactly, yeah.
And the most prominent thing here, because it's angular, is this Saturn in Virgo, very close to the ascendant, what's like 7 degrees away. Retrograde, Lily said this is one of the worst things in horror, the retrograde Saturn rising in the first.
Okay.
Exactly opposite the sun, and it's his solar return. And the sun rules the 12th here. And it's the exalted ruler of the 8th.
Yeah.
And in addition, there's this T-square to Neptune, also angular. So the most angular planets are in this really tight T-square in Alaska. Neptune in Sagittarius, and anything else here? Well, what did I say here? Oh, Mercury, which rules the ascendants in the 6th, which is not and it's debilitated in Pisces. So he's a debilitated ascendant ruler in the 6th quadrant house, Placidus house.
Ruler of the ascendant is in the 6th house.
And it's tightly connected by sextile to the Venus, which is the I'm not sure, in the 9th. So there's a connection to 9th house travel here. Solar trim, Jupiter, Mars, and Rahu are conjoined. Oh yeah, there's this
Mercury
cluster.
Is also an airy planet, so we can also have a small indication as to the air crash.
And this cluster in the 12th house, this was conjunct the 8th house cusp in the Spain solar return. But in the Alaska solar return, it's in the 12th. So this is what I meant by different perspectives. If we look in Spain, this cluster, which looks pretty stressful, right? Jupiter is in Virgo, the sign opposite where it rules, conjunct the Mars. And conjunct the node, and it's a stationary node. In the 8th in Spain, warning of some sort of life or death situation. And in the 12th, which is the house of undoing, loss. So similar, it's a different perspective on how this cluster will play out.
Sure.
The Neptune, I'm not sure why the plane crashed, or whether there was some mechanical problem, but Neptune often has to do with things not functioning the way they should, or overlooking some important fact that then works against you.
Okay.
But here, either way, the charts look kind of stressful.
Yeah.
And if I said, this is my solar return in Alaska, should I go there this year? I immediately, any astrologer say, no, Saturn opposite the sun, exactly, in an angular house, and square the Neptune. No, don't do this.
Yeah.
Oh, and here, and also this cluster is square the Uranus, which is a symbol of sudden accidents. So here, sudden accidents, Uranus is in a house of travel, the 3rd, not necessarily plane travel, but local travel. Right?
Yeah.
So warning of a potential travel accident. Let's go back to the other chart. Here's the birthplace solar return. So here, the Uranus was in the 10th, and it squared this. So potential for death related to 10th house is his work. He was filming a documentary for his profession. And here, if we look at the Uranus, he was traveling to film that locally through Alaska, because he was following the Iditarod dog race and making a documentary of it. Oh, interesting. Yeah. It occurred to me, dogs are 6th house, right?
6th house, yes.
And the ruler of this ascendant is in the 6th, so he's engaged in some 6th house activity. He's filming dogs racing in Alaska.
Sure, yeah.
So that's what I meant by different perspectives.
But I think both the charts kind of signify tension in some way. So.
Yeah. Well, the aspects are the same. It's just they're placed in different houses. And this is, here I put the Alaska solar return with the natal chart around it. Oh, and here, this is quite impressive. His natal Uranus is right on the cusp of the 8th house. Sudden death, right? Would be a meaning of that. This is in the Alaska chart. Yeah. So, I wouldn't say one is correct and the other's wrong. I would just say they're both correct, but they give you a different angle on what's, so to speak, on what's happening.
I mean, there is no question of wrong, but I mean, it's just brainstorming about what to do and how to work with. So.
And I'm just looking, this is the Alaska return. Taurus is intercepted in the 9th, and it would be the whole sign 9th. And its ruler, Venus, is conjunct the Mercury. So he's on a plane flight that ends up badly.
Yeah.
And this is all opposite this cluster at the end of Leo, Mars. Right. And he's got this conjoining his Ketu here in the solar return.
6th house.
So, I mean, I think this is a good example why taking these extreme positions, you can't say that the birthplace chart is more accurate than the location chart, because they both gave clear warnings of something ominous that could happen.
Sure. Yeah.
Okay, so let me stop the sharing. That was okay. Now you wanted to look at another chart, or were there other comments about this chart? Or?
See, of course, it's undeniable that both the solar revolutions chart kind of indicate some kind of tension, and there is no question of which is right and which is wrong. Uh, Even from philosophical point of view, I think we cannot term either of it as a wrong technique. But I just want to also see what this one that I prepared shows.
Yeah. Let me just make one more comment about this.
Yeah.
If he had consulted you and said, is this a good time for me to go to Alaska? You would have looked at his chart and you would have seen, at least with the tropical chart. Well, if you go to Alaska, you're going to have a retrograde Saturn as the most prominent angular planet opposing your sun from the 1st to the 7th. I think it's a bad idea. You don't want to make that the most prominent aspect in your chart this year. You want to maybe move that to more cadent house or something.
And it's just the first day. He was gone.
Yeah.
On the first
well,
day.
To me, I picked this because that was so striking. I mean, he had his solar return, and within hours, he had the plane crash.
Yeah, that's very visceral.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. And you're using the sidereal zodiac.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so I got, are you able to see it well now?
I can see it, yeah.
Okay, so I was using Robin Williams's chart, and the one on the left is the natal chart, and the one on the right is the solar revolutions. And
okay.
It's again about the death. I think it's just by chance that both of us have taken death as example, but so we have Libra rising in the nativity, and we see that Libra has gone on to the 12th house in the solar revolutions, which itself indicates some kind of an end, as it is. And here, the one on the yellow, the 5th house is the profected sign of the year, Aquarius, and Saturn becomes the ruler of the year, or the lord of the year, or the profected ascendant lord. So, sorry?
I was going to, this reminds something Marinus said is that a thing to look for in solar returns is when there's a repeat of an aspect or a connection between two planets in the birth from birth.
And the solar revolution.
Pointing out at birth, you have Mars square Saturn.
Yeah.
And then in the solar return, they're both in the same sign. They're not quite within orb, but they will conjoin in that sign.
Yeah, and make no mistake, we're using whole sign houses and sidereal zodiac. So whole sign houses, it still counts as an aspect, I think, even though,
they're in the same sign. So Marinus would say, because Mars and Saturn are highlighted in the solar return, that will bring the natal connection between them, configuration between them into prominence this year.
Yeah, sure. And Saturn, the ruler of the profected sign of the year, is already placed in the 12th house in the natal chart, indicating again end and loss. And we also have the same position in the solar revolutions as well. But the one thing is, it's well dignified in the solar revolutions, but still 12th house probably is a difficult house in any way. So and
you have both malefics in the 12th, which is
both
a
the
difficult
malefics.
Year.
So I also did a primary directions from the solar revolutions ascendant, and we have the ascendant in Sagittarius in the bounds of Jupiter, and Sagittarius happens to be the 3rd house of the natal chart, and here Sagittarius happens to be the 2nd house of the solar revolutions. And 3rd house is also related to the longevity in Vedic astrology, and 2nd house is the 12th from the 3rd, which again signifies some kind of 12th house matters. In the natal chart, ruler of Sagittarius, Jupiter, is placed in the bounds of Mars in Pisces, still well dignified, but it's in the 12th house, indicating some kind of disease or illness.
Mm-hmm.
And in the solar revolution chart, you would not say the same thing because Jupiter is well dignified in the ninth house. So there is some kind of uh, hidden thing that's going on, which is not directly visible. But still, if you look at the natal position, I think Jupiter is, even though it's in the it's in its own sign, it's strong, and it's going to promote the sixth house matters, especially
Mm-hmm.
illness. So, and MC is placed in the bounds of Saturn, and we already spoke a lot about Saturn here. In the 12th house in both natal and solar returns, and also prominent aspect with the Mars in both the charts.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll just move on to the location of physical presence. Uh, the birth location is Chicago, and the physical location is I think it's in California,
Look at Paradise City.
Paradise K. Yeah,
Oh,
I think it's in California.
yeah.
So
He died in California.
yeah, he died in California. Yeah.
Oh,
So
yeah, you got Saturn right on the ascendant there.
yes,
Look at that.
Saturn is on the ascendant.
Yeah.
With Mars, it's going to, and Mars is in the bounds of
Mm-hmm.
Saturn. So so we have Libra rising in both the cases. So that's one of those important things, indicating something that is directly related to the native itself. But there's one thing that kind of is confusing for me in this is eighth house is very strong, and ruler of the ascendant Venus is placed in the ninth house along with Mercury being well received. So
Mm-hmm.
I was not sure whether if I would predict death with this chart. Uh, but on the other hand, we can also say that eighth house matter is getting prominent because of Moon being in the eighth house, and eighth house is not a very comfortable house. But still, I think just Saturn and Mars on the ascendant speaks volumes about what this native is going to face. And one more thing is Saturn is dignified in the first house itself. It's the house, it's the sign of its exaltation.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not sure if I would predict death with this chart, uh, because but do you think it's I was just looking for your views.
Well, I think Saturn right on the ascendant, right? It's almost exact.
Yeah.
Saturn is a classical symbol of death. I
Yeah.
wouldn't necessarily say this is death, but clearly
Yeah,
it's
that,
consistent with the death.
yeah, I mean it's consistent with the event, but I was thinking whether I would predict death if I was asked to do it before the event. So that's what I was thinking. But still, I'm sure it indicates, as you pointed out, it surely indicates death related matters is actually coming into focus.
Mm-hmm.
So seventh lord Mars is placed in the first house, and it's the sign of its detriment, and it's also placed in Saturn's bounds.
And Mars is the out of sect malefic, so
Again,
it's
yeah, it's not very easy.
now in Western we usually use the 12th for suicide.
Oh,
I don't
okay.
know in Vedic is it the same or
Uh,
because it's a house of
in Vedic,
self undoing.
yeah, I think we look at the combination of both 12th house and 8th house, but predominantly 12th house is suicide.
So Mars in the 12th could indicate that.
Yeah.
And there are a number of astrologers who've written that often at the time of death, Jupiter is prominent and the ninth house is prominent.
Okay.
And the theory they've suggested is that it's kind of the ninth house in Hellenistic is the house of God.
Mm.
And it's kind of your final journey back to heaven.
Great.
And also it's the benefic, like a benefic in the eighth here, like Venus in the eighth, could signify a relief of suffering, that there's a benefic influence. Through death, he was relieved of his suffering, because he was suffering from severe dementia, and I think he didn't want to
Okay.
continue living with it. And I think he decided that it would be better to die than to deteriorate, to have his brain just deteriorate that way.
Okay.
So it was a kind of a euthanasia chart. It wasn't he decided he didn't want to suffer anymore and to put an end to it.
Okay. And we have the MC in the bounds of Mercury and ascendant in the bounds of Venus. Venus is the lord of the rising, so and Venus is placed in the 9th house. So now that you have mentioned that in Hellenistic astrology, it also indicates death. So maybe that makes sense, but it did not really make sense.
I think that's more modern, not Hellenistic, but there's some modern astrologers who view it as
okay.
a final journey, and if there's a benefic there, it's away from suffering to a more heavenly realm.
Okay. Yeah, but I'm not sure. I just wanted to have your views with this chart, and I did not want to make any. I did not want to come to a conclusion. So, but I just attached the primary directions as well, because I thought it did not. It did not indicate direct death as it is. So that's what I thought. Yeah.
Well, let's look more carefully.
Yeah.
We go back. This is the California return.
The one on the right is.
Yeah, on the right. Yeah.
But one thing is, Mercury also rules the 12th house, and so as one of the time lords as bound ruler, I think Mercury is also very prominent in promoting 12th house activities as well of the solar.
I mean, Mercury rules the 12th, which could be his decision to end his life, the suicide.
Yeah.
Venus rules the ascendant, which is his body.
Yeah.
And it also rules the 8th, his length of life. So he decides to end his life. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mercury and Venus. Cool.
Yeah.
Okay. So I don't have any more examples. I think this is. I think it's up to people to go ahead and test and see what they find.
Yeah, and the 9th house. See, again, we're focusing just on his death, but maybe there were other 9th house issues going on in his life
that we don't know of.
Maybe he'd been planning a trip and he couldn't take it, or had some 9th house stuff going on, or we just don't know. But the prominence of the 9th house there, just because it doesn't relate to the nature of his death, that's one event from the whole year.
Yeah, that's very important to note.
And the 9th house is also our belief system, our philosophy of life, so that maybe it reflects that he thought this through and had to struggle with his own belief system to make the decision to kill himself.
Yeah.
We don't know, but that it's not beyond the realm of possibility that.
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah.
Because we don't see the connection doesn't mean it doesn't describe what his life was like at that time.
I think the connection is there. The connection is there, but maybe as you said, it's just the one event, and solar return chart indicates the entire year and not just one event during that one particular time. So it's important to consider the holistic view of one entire year and see what planets has to offer in accordance to the natal promise.
Yeah, and it's not just the events, it's what's going on internally, psychologically with him.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I think it was a great brainstorming session as it is. And yeah, did you have anything more to add as it is?
No, the only thing I would add is that when there are controversies like this, I think the best approach is to
look at both.
study a lot of charts from both points of view,
Yeah.
and not get into it's got either this is right or that is right. Not get into extremes, but if there are large groups who swear by a technique, there's probably something to it. And it doesn't mean I'm right and you're wrong, or vice versa. It probably means we're both.
I'm not sure if there is anything wrong in astrology, but still, I was reading an article by someone who was not advocating, but who was just teaching someone to use solar returns for the current location, and it did not sound really odd to me. It just sounded natural and organic. So, which kind of made me less dogmatic about my own approach, and I've been testing it for over a month, and I think it's just that how we view and how we see and how we perceive things. So, yeah.
But my experience, having done this with charts for a long time now, is sometimes the birthplace chart is very obviously correct. But sometimes you don't see a major event in the birthplace chart, and when you relocate it, it just stands out like, oh, that's obvious.
Yeah. I mean, I've always used only the birth location ever since I started using solar revolutions. I've never tested this, but I've only been doing it very recently. So it's really very early for me to come to a conclusion on anything just based on a specific study that is not based on a study or something like that. So I just want to continue testing this, but still I think I would stick to the birth location. Maybe I'll look at both and see both the angles of it from now on. So
yeah. Now, have you had a solar return where you were far from home where you could test it?
No, I was not so serious about astrology when I was away from home, but there was not really, I did not have any major event when I was away from home for 2 years, but did not have much major events. So yeah, I've always stayed at my birth location.
Okay.
So I had to rely on someone else's chart to do this. So that's one.
Yeah, most people, unless you travel a lot, you probably are fairly near where you were born on your solar return, so it's not going to make a difference. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Yeah. So I think that pretty much brings us towards the end of this show, and thanks so much for joining.
Oh, it's always fun.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay, take care.